people have brought to us in thinking about how we relate to sea and country, and how important it is that we continue to acknowledge their input. As I mentioned before, if you can stay on mute during this meeting, webinar, any questions, please put things into the chat, and I will raise those questions once Nick has finished her presentation. And I think the other thing is that we will be recording this meeting today. So for everyone, please be aware of the fact that this should be recorded. So I think without any further ado, I want to hand over to Dr. Nicole Shumway. Nick is a research fellow in the Centre for Policy Futures. And her area of particular focus is in marine law and environment. I think Nick can probably describe her background even better than I can. So Nick, I will hand it over to you. Thank you.
Probably helps if I unmute myself. Thanks, Liz. Really appreciate it. As Liz said, my name is Nikki Shumway. I'm a research fellow in the Centre for Policy Futures, and I have a joint appointment in the UQ Law School as well. I actually started as a marine scientist, doing field work and tagging turtles of all things. And as I progressed in my career, I found that policy was really the way to make the sort of broad scale change that I wanted to see for the conservation of species. And so that's what's brought me to where I am today, speaking to all of you. So a fairly broad topic today, and rather than talk about one particular project that I'm on, sorry, I'm just trying to minimize the screen. It's just not working. Apologies. Rather than talk about one project today, I am instead going to take you on the restoration journey that I have been on for the past 6 years or so. I should also note that I'm pretty remote right now, so I'm on a Starlink. If I do cut out, I apologize. It's usually pretty good, but you just never know. But I will be back if I do cut out. So as you all are probably very aware, the protection of marine ecosystems is the primary mechanism for conservation in Australia and globally. However, there is an increasing recognition really everywhere that really protected areas are also declining through time, both as a result of climate change and of human impacts. This is some imagery from the 2019 Great Barrier Reef Outlook Report, which was used in the report to show shifting baselines for inshore coral reefs. You can see the photos on the left. Those black and white photos show really diverse reef flat systems dominated by live coral, and gradually through time, they're becoming more patchy, algal-dominated ecosystems with fewer live coral. Now, I don't have a study to back this up, so I'm happy to debate this afterwards, but I would premise that there is probably not a single marine ecosystem globally, really, that would still be considered pristine or intact. So the need for restoration or rehabilitations of these habitats is really a strong one. But right now, there are a range of barriers to upscaling restoration. These are broader than just policy. That's what I'll be focusing on today, but these are also things like short funding cycles, um, coordination at large scales. This is really great work done by a colleague of mine, Megan Saunders, at CSIRO, on developing a roadmap for marine and coastal restoration. And as you can see, the governance landscape was considered one of the largest barriers to upscaling restoration on the scale that is needed. So about 6 years ago, we really started investigating this issue further. Basically, we were working with an NGO, and they came to us and said, this is a huge problem we're having. Can you do some research on it? This paper at the top was one of the first stabs at this. And what we did was evaluated a few different permitting frameworks for restoration, and found that there were a whole range of problems that hadn't really been documented, maybe because restoration at that stage wasn't scaled up as much as it is now currently being scaled up. But what we found was, probably nothing new to many of you, but some very restrictive permitting issues, legislation that was complex and often fragmented over multiple scales, and a real lack of enabling mechanisms within the legislative frameworks. The bottom is similar work that a colleague of mine, Pedro Fidelman, also in the Center for Policy Futures, did around the same time, looking at similar issues for coral reefs under restoration and climate change in the Great Barrier Reef. So this is a really great diagram. I think I show this all the time because I just feel like without even knowing what any of it says, you can see how complicated the regulatory frameworks can get. So this was work done by Pedro in that paper through the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program, where he assessed key elements of the Great Barrier Reef governance framework. I'm not going to get into this in a huge amount of detail. The two main clusters are the ones relevant for reef restoration at the state and the federal level. And you can see the blue boxes are like the main decision-making agencies, and the black is all the different policies or legislative requirements. But needless to say, it's quite complex. So we know it's complex, right? But we kept speaking to restoration practitioners who kind of would tell us it's not just about the complexity. It's a bit deeper than that, but it was sort of difficult to figure out what was so challenging. So in a paper that we did, which was led by my colleague Justine Bell-James at the UQ Law School, we interviewed a range of restoration practitioners about the regulatory barriers that they were facing. So what we did was we asked them to go through a project or a couple of projects that were particularly challenging from a legal or from a governance standpoint, and to just step us through every step of the process, sort of where they were really challenged. And what we found was actually pretty astounding. Not just, and some of NGOs are fairly small, right? So it's time consuming, it's expensive, we know this. But there are also a lot of more pervasive governance challenges that are arising. So this is a great figure from the paper, which kind of goes through every step of the permitting process and then some of the challenges that may arise. And at any stage, they might sort of have to go back to the start. But some of the biggest challenges we really found was challenges around condition setting, having multiple conditions set by different departments, policy driving restoration locations. That was a really big one. So, we would talk to restoration practitioners and they would say, look, there was this great site. It was semi-vegetated. It could, it was a little bit trashed maybe. It would have been great for restoration, but because there was marine plants, it was difficult to get a permit there. And then it was also within a marine park. So that was also, really challenging and probably a no-go. What we ended up doing was going to a bear patch site for restoration next to this industrial area. And so you can see that for practitioners, some of these permitting challenges is actually driving site location to maybe suboptimal locations, because there are a lot of reasons why you might want to be in a landscape that, from a connectivity standpoint, and from a resilience standpoint, where you want to have connectivity and you want to have um, some vegetation cover. So that is a challenge. And then what we also found, which hadn't been something that had surprisingly come up before, was that proponents of restoration projects, as I said, some of them quite small scale NGOs, were being asked to take on legal liability in perpetuity, so forever, for these restoration works. So they would go out, they would get indemnity insurance for these projects. And so we talked to some of these NGOs and they said, we're happy to take on legal liability for some of these projects, for one project or two projects. But if we start upscaling these public good projects on the scale that we need to, we can't keep taking on this liability. Eventually, something, who knows what, but something might happen. And, it's really going to put our NGO in a tough position. So the question then becomes, at what stage is a restoration or a rehabilitation project no longer considered a structure, right? At what point does it become, an ecosystem? At what point does it become part of the environment? And from a liability perspective, it's dealt with as any other ecosystem would be. I note there are a broad range of government departments here throughout Australia. So I'm sure this is a question that some of you have grappled with in your roles. As far as I'm aware, there's no real answer to this currently and no policy on how to move this forward. So if you have some ideas or this is something you're working on, feel free to get in touch. So it's really not just about the complexity of the permitting, right? It's also about the intent of the legislation. Governance frameworks for marine environments were really developed to protect and preserve marine ecosystems, to limit harm from projects, right? So this is really effective where impacts are discrete, like development projects, like this port project, right? Even so, there are, a range of impacts that might occur, but they're fairly localized. But when impacts are more pervasive, for example, like cumulative impacts from climate change or, the sort of pervasive of humans in the landscape, those sort of protection-based regimes are really less effective for addressing those issues. And what this means for restoration or rehabilitation projects is really assessed in the same way as development projects. So they go through the same assessment framework as an infrastructure development project. I was speaking to somebody actually who put it really well a couple of weeks ago from New South Wales to Kew, who said the benefits of a project are considered, but they're not assessed. So they're considered, but they're not assessed in the same systematic way that impacts are considered. So in practice, this really means that this sort of protection-based paradigm can have the perverse effect of inhibiting restoration activities and will actually currently are sort of acting as a bottleneck between our ability to restore degraded habitats um, and um, and deliver, benefits from ecosystem restoration projects. And I always get this, so I want to preface this by saying I'm not saying that there should be no permits and like interventions should just be allowed, like, without any oversight. I don't think anybody thinks that is true. But I think that there can be a way to do it that recognizes the public good um, of the interventions taking place, and that the policy has a really important role, right, in telling people, the best practice way to restore, planning for where restoration can occur. Um, but I think it's also important to recognize that the threats to marine ecosystems are changing and that our approach to conservation needs also to change to reflect that. Um, this is a really great photo, I think, that kind of demonstrates um, this sort of it's not really from legislation, but the benefits of restoration. This is a photo from Mosley et al., and it's two sides of a tidal gate. So one side is exposed to tidal flow, and the other side has had historical restrictions to tidal flow. And this is at Dry Creek in St. Kilda. So why is this so important? I know probably all of you are aware of this, but there's increasingly, it's recognized the importance of marine restoration, particularly for conservation of biodiversity, but also to meet national and international targets. So at the international level, we're about the midway point of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. We also have the Global Biodiversity Framework Target 2, to which Australia is a party, which means that we have agreed to try to restore 30% of all degraded marine and coastal ecosystems by 2030. So that's a huge upscaling of where we are now. And this obviously then trickles down at the Commonwealth level to Australia's strategy for nature, and through private investment in restoration and nature conservation. And obviously, all of the strategies happening at the state and council, NRM groups, private proponents. These are just two examples of blue carbon strategies that have recently come into force. There are way too many to put up here, but I recognize that there are a lot of top up projects happening as well. So on top of the policy issues for more what we would call traditional restoration practice, also ongoing interventions being proposed and trialed in the Great Barrier Reef to increase ecosystem resilience to climate change. So for the last 4 years, I have been part of the regulatory subprogram for the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program in the Great Barrier Reef. So this is a Commonwealth-funded program looking at trialing and developing interventions that can help build some climate resilience in the Great Barrier Reef. So these are things like um, coral seeding, potentially into the future, selective breeding and assisted evolution of corals so that they have beneficial traits, whether that's stress tolerance or thermal tolerance, things like marine cloud brightenings. Um, but this presents a whole new set of policy challenges and management issues around the ones that I've just discussed. So a range of things, the ethics of it, should we be doing sort of intervention to try to adapt to climate change? The governance issues, I'll get into those a bit separately in a minute. Engagement and social acceptability of the projects. There's also an incomplete knowledge of risk and uncertainty of future benefit. And there's challenges around the science. Like, even if we try to do this, like, can we? The Great Barrier Reef is an enormous ecosystem. Can we even achieve measurable change? So the role of regulations in these sorts of novel interventions becomes really complicated, actually, but also really, really important um, to guide the strategies forward and achieve outcomes. So things like what to restore, where you do it, how you do it. A big one for these sort of reef projects is who who should benefit from this, As like the Great Barrier Reef is huge, you can't put these interventions in everywhere, so you have to choose locations. And if you're choosing that, one area is going to benefit, that means another area won't. Um, and so there's a lot of, values for the people that live there and love the reef. And that's really challenging sort of decision making for decision makers. Um, and things like, preconditions for reef restoration, translating the scientific knowledge into standards, community participation, how to incentivize actions, those sort of things. And obviously, uncertainty in these sort of settings is a huge challenge, right? Um, as I said, the regulations are really developed to prevent impacts within a marine protected area. But if impacts are already happening and you have this background of decline, how these projects will be, assessed, for their impact relative to their benefit, particularly if that benefit isn't seen until, 20 or 30 or 50 years into the future, potentially, if at all. It is a real challenge, I think, both for the people, proposing the restoration, but also for the decision makers, trying to anticipate what climate future we're regulating for, and making decisions now, um, you know, in anticipation of those future impacts. And obviously, I'm sure this graph is something that most people are familiar with. It shows the different climate trajectories. Um, RCP 4.5, this orange one down at the bottom, I think is sort of the most likely scenario. Our goal is to stay below 2 degrees warming, which is that blue one at the bottom. And if we stay below 2 degrees, which we've mostly past at this stage. You get healthy coral reefs. As you start to creep up and the water gets warmer, as I'm sure most of you are aware, you get bleaching more often. You get more climate impacts, um, and the need to try, if possible, perhaps to build in that climate resilience. And so trying to anticipate and regulate for these future impacts is really challenging, though all evidence suggests that the sooner we start to do this, the better off ecosystems will be. So these novel interventions really put strain on the existing regulatory frameworks, right? Like, you know, they weren't necessarily designed with these sorts of future-facing interventions in mind. So there's a lot of uncertainty, as I said, around the potential impact relative to benefit, relative to climate futures. Apologies. Hope everyone can hear me. That was the Starlink cutting out. They're missing frameworks. So not all aspects of these projects are currently regulated for the purposes they're being used for. There's a pacing problem, so a lot of the projects evolve faster than the regulations. Multi-sector, that's not, too different from the traditional restoration. And then how do you enable innovation without undue harm, and expertise as well. So a lot of these projects are so novel that the person leading this project might be the only person in that does this sort of work. So I was talking with a, with someone who does the cloud brightening project, and it turns out there's only like 2 cloud physicists in all of Australia. So it's that kind of novelty that is really a challenge for frameworks. And so with that in mind, how do you move forward? I'm getting to the solution parts now, not just the challenges. So how do you move forward? How do you sort of enable these interventions in a safe way, so that they can benefit the environment, but also without causing undue harm, before they're ready? So I think there are really likely 3 types of solutions, and I'll move from sort of least complex to most complex. The first one is guidance to minimize complexity for restoration practitioners. So this is really work within the existing frameworks to help guide people doing restoration, help take them through the governance process or the permitting process. And then, how are other people dealing with those challenges in other contexts? And this is really unlikely to address some of those more pervasive legal issues that we discussed. So things like how risk is assessed and liability for projects. But it's sort of a good stopgap to work through before making larger changes. So this is an example of some permitting guidance we developed a few years ago as part of a NEST project, so a National Environmental Science Project. And so basically what we did was mapped the permitting framework for 2 types of restoration projects: reintroduction of tidal flow and oyster reef restoration in 4 states, and looked at each potential component of a project, what that might then trigger in legislative frameworks, and then give some information on, what the permitting requirements might be, whether they were required or not required. And so this was a project led by Justine Bell James, and we developed sort of this stoplight sort of system, um, where, a red light is a permit, it was definitely required, an orange light was a permit maybe required, a green light, like, it's a self-assessable code. This is just one example. There are about 12 pages in the appendix of data to back this up. So that's available online if anyone is interested. But as you can see, there's not a whole lot of just green lights for practitioners.
Nick, can I just stop you for a sec? I think your slides
Oh, have we
may
stopped?
have stopped moving. Do you want to have a go at unsharing and
Yeah,
sharing again to see if we can
yes,
get it going?
yes. Sorry about that. I'll stop sharing. Hmm. Sorry, just give me 1 second. Oh, it was stopped sharing on my screen as well, or in the right. There you go. Is that better?
Yes, definitely new slide.
Perfect. Sorry. So that is the stoplight system that we're using. And this is another example of some work that we did through the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program. What we really wanted to do was a big review of how more novel interventions were being governed in and legislated in other countries, or in other contexts, given all of the challenges that we found. And really what we found through this massive literature review was that Australia is pretty world leading in doing this sort of novel interventions work. Um, and so there weren't a whole lot of specific examples of how to govern these sorts of things. And so there would be some really general recommendations. So say it would be, policy should be flexible and adaptive, which is great in theory, but in practice, how does a decision maker take that and make that useful in their context? If there's no examples of how to make something adaptive, like how often do you review something? How do you build that flexibility into policy? So there was really little governance guidance for that. And I should also note that most of the papers that we looked at were like 80% or something were 2018. So it's pretty just within the last 3, 4 at that time, 3 or 4 years. Um, and so these types of really general policy recommendations were really pervasive in the literature. But what we wanted to do was try to pick out examples and really specific ways that policymakers could actually implement those into policy. So what we did was we sort of took all of those recommendations, and they more or less fit into these 6 principles. And then we started trying to build sort of a best practice sort of guidance for how you might govern these sort of coral reef interventions. But because the recommendations, they're coming from, they're coming from conservation, they're coming from, coastal and marine restoration, they're coming from all different, areas. they're really not just for coral reef restoration. They could also be applied to many other areas of conservation. So I won't get into this too much, but these were the sort of broad principles. So one that I've circled there is proactive forward planning. So this is just some general information, but then within each section, what we wanted to do was say, okay, and this is how you might build that in, this is how you might develop a horizon scanning practice that you can then, you do it every few years, and then you use it to help anticipate future changes and prepare that for them before they actually happen. So, if, you hit this sort of trigger point where this is happening in a marine ecosystem, you've already worked through that. And you have some policy responses at the ready that might be able to address that. So this is another project which was led by Justine Bell James that I was a part of, that was really taking those legal challenges that we found and trying to find solutions, like not a huge review of solution, because I think that does need to be done, but sort of a bright spots overview to sort of say, okay, here's the challenge that we're facing, and here's some examples of how other countries have dealt with that. So as an example, that legal liability issue that we were talking about earlier, we looked at an artificial reef in Scotland, the Loch Lynn artificial reef, and they were sort of struggling with the same liability issues. And what they decided on was that pre-construction liability would be the same as any other project. And then the proponent was then granted a permanent deposit license for the project after that, which took away any liability. And so this may or may not be an effective solution for Australia. But what I think is important is that we're sort of moving into not just looking at the challenges. Yes, there are challenges, there's a lot of them, but there are also solutions, and there are things we can do to move restoration forward. Um, So the most feasible solution in the near term is probably that incremental policy change. So small scale law and policy reforms, um, and in consultation, stakeholders were um, were quite keen that it should include things like self-assessable codes, updated risk assessment processes, and dedicated permitting pathways for restoration. And so a few examples of these, self-assessable codes in particular was one of the things that came up often in consultations with a lot of restoration practitioners advocating for accepted development codes for certain activities, whereby a proponent could, self-assess parts of their project as long as it complies with, um, certain things, which might be, staying below certain trigger points or managing impacts in a certain way. These are two examples of self accessible codes that are going forward in Queensland. So this are marine plants and operational works for waterway barriers. I'm sure that there are more going ahead than this. But these are two great examples that can sort of help minimize some of that regulatory complexity. And I think they'll be useful for some of those proof of concept and smaller scale restoration projects. but perhaps not those large scale projects into the future. And these sort of codes could also be modeled and include, rather than just size trigger limits, for example, but perhaps like risk trigger limits, right? So this is sort of a risk matrix we suggested a few years ago in a paper where you sort of um, uh, tailor the permitting process relative to the potential risk of a project proposes. So, if something's low risk, common method, existing widespread use, um, perhaps those could go ahead with a self-accessible codes. But if something had like a more moderate risk, which, maybe it's really common elsewhere, but not applied quite in that setting or in the same ecosystem, um, then you permit it, and as things become more novel or have higher risk, the permitting structure gets more intense. And so then the last and most complex to probably implement is large scale law reform. And this option would be extremely time and resource intensive, given the large number of sort of intertwined conservation laws, and would probably make these reforms really difficult. And at this stage, I would be surprised if there's the political appetite for these sort of large scale transformative change. And that would be to have restoration specific frameworks, or if you want to zoom out a little bit, maybe more intervention specific frameworks. Um, so one of the mechanisms being employed is the use of specific policies, and that sort of prevents that science policy lag that we discussed for some of these more novel projects. So this is a really great example of some adaptive policy in the Great Barrier Reef. It's the policy on Great Barrier Reef interventions. Where they've really set out, okay, this is what we consider low risk, this is what we consider high risk, medium risk, and this is how we will approach those. And these sorts of specific policies can be updated regularly, really, and fit into the legislative framework without having to, update regulations. I know there's similar policy underway in Queensland for marine parks outside of the Great Barrier Reef. And there's also some more dedicated policy planning pathways that are being undertaken in New South Wales to take it so that restoration or other interventions will sort of be in their own stream as part of the planning framework. And so we're not quite here yet in Australia, but quite a few global restoration specific regulations going ahead globally. The EU Nature Restoration Regulation, which underpins the EU biodiversity strategy and then sets binding targets for ecosystem restoration for member countries, and requires that those countries submit national restoration strategies by 2026. The UK Environment Act also sets binding targets for ecosystem restoration for 4 priority areas: air quality, water, biodiversity, and waste. And another one, which has been enforced for a little bit, law for the promotion of nature restoration in Japan, which I actually don't know that much about, but establishes principles of restoration. and stipulates guidelines and stakeholders and responsibilities for restoration implementation. So this is happening globally, and as I said, I don't know that Australia is really there yet, but I do think that if we are going to upscale restoration on the scale needed to combat ecosystem decline, that this will potentially be a way forward in the future. And so going back to some imagery from the first slide, I'm sure you're all familiar with the map of marine protected areas in Australia. And if we really want to upscale to meet this 30% target for coastal and marine ecosystems, we are really going to need to work towards planning ecosystem restoration in a sort of all of ecosystem approach rather than as we're doing right now, which is sort of on, in a piecemeal way that right now doesn't really contribute hugely to like coordinated goals at the national or even at regional levels. And so this is the sort of work that I'm hoping to move forward in the next few years. And if anyone has ideas on this or would like to get in touch, please feel free. And I'm also going to use this as a plug for my current project, which is a national environmental science program project on nature repair in Australian coastal and marine ecosystems. And what myself and some colleagues are doing in this project is looking at the reintroduction of tidal flow and oyster restoration, and speaking with decision makers about how projects are assessed, these sorts of projects are considered and assessed. So if I haven't gotten in touch with you and this is work that you're doing, please feel free to get in touch. I'd love to speak with you.
Thanks, Nikki, for a really interesting presentation. I'm sure there's a few questions that are coming through the chat. So I'm happy to read them to you so you can concentrate on the answers rather than trying to read and think at the same time, which is a bit challenging. So the first one is from James, who's asking, is carbon and carbon markets being considered as a part of these initiatives?
Yep, I think that carbon and carbon markets do have a really big role to play. My focus really is on biodiversity conservation, but I think that there is a way, definitely, to make sure that carbon strategies and nature strategies are intertwined, and that might mean, assessing those sorts of benefits. Like, you get a certain amount of benefit from carbon if you do, a blue carbon project in this way. Often the biodiversity benefit is considered a co-benefit, but I think it's increasingly important to recognize that you can't really separate them and that they should be going forward in a way that benefits both.
Thanks, Nick. This is a slightly longer question, so from Jamie, as distinct from James. So Jamie's asking, I'm wondering if there are clear guidelines, potential indicators and thresholds that determine if a mangrove forest, seagrass meadow, temperate reef or coral reef is degraded and warrants intervention and restoration. Clear interpretations, definitions of degraded ecosystems from regulators, researchers and stakeholders may assist in speed permits are given to restore habitat. When is the ecosystem so degraded that it's not able to perform the ecosystem functions that normally would and needs intervention and restoration? Can we classify degraded areas, ecosystems for intervention?
Yeah, that's a really great point. So interestingly, that, that GBF target about 30% says, he's quite keenly like recognize that it says degraded ecosystems. There is no, there is a definition of degraded, but I think, countries can interpret degraded, one degraded in one country might be relatively pristine in another, right? So that is very open to interpretation. Um, but as far as I know at this stage, and someone please feel free to correct me, there's no real, sorry, it was a long question, so I'm trying to get to it as easily as possible. As far as I know, that there's no real comprehensive strategy for, what are the most likely habitats to be, easily restored, how we would do that, at what stage we would just walk away. And obviously, there's the added uncertainty of climate change, might be okay now, but will it be okay in 20 years? And is it worth putting, those sorts of funds, those limited funds, into habitats that, might, be, you know, not survivable given climate change. So I think those are all really challenging questions that haven't yet been addressed in any sort of systematic way.
Thanks. Sharon has asked the question, has there been much research into how effective the restoration projects are, and what statistics about those, further, what are the statistics about those that be left and no longer need monitoring or maintenance, and those that are required to be removed or at least maintained?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think this has been a big challenge with restoration projects, and actually one that I'm not addressing through that NEST project that I said at that NEST 4.1, but colleagues are. So we recognize that, there's a whole range of restoration projects. Some are still in that proof of concept phase, but really some of these restoration projects have been happening for 10, 15, 20 years. There are some challenges to actually seeing how well they've done. Funding cycles are a really big one. A lot of times people get funding for only a couple years, and then, they're not actually, long-term monitoring might only be 4 or 5 years, not 20 years like we need. So what colleagues are doing, they're trying to gather through the ACRN, which is the Australian Coastal Restoration Network website, all of the projects that they can find and how successful they have been. So sort of show that, that while some might still be emerging, some might actually be quite successful, and be able to move forward in those contexts. Sorry, I'm aware of the time, so I'm trying to be quick.
That's right. There's a sort of follow-up question from Neil, which I think is a follow-on to this, which is around what is seen as success or failure and how that's defined. Do you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, that's a good point, because there is no right now systematic way of how success is defined by project. Sometimes, success is reported as a percent of the overall success of the project. Sometimes it's based on the number of, like, the amount of survival relative to what was planted. And so it's really hard to know between different projects, like, how they average out, or what success actually means. And I think that's something that they're also trying to address, because I feel like if you can, say, there have been 100 of these projects, and, they're 95% successful, and this is what that means, then maybe that, takes some of that risk for decision makers out of it, and can sort of progress the projects.
Thanks, Nick. We're pretty much out of time, so I want to say two things. The first thing is, on the screen, Nicole's email address is there. So for those of you who might have a question later or who want to take up Nick's invitation to get involved with her work program, please jot down her email address, because you can email her even while she's traveling around Australia. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, I just want to say thank you very much, Nick, for taking the time out today to talk to us about this. It was a really interesting presentation. I think it had a lot in it. I'm still digesting some of it, and I'm absolutely fascinated about the relationship between the marine and the on-land sort of questions that are being raised, and the differences and the similarities. But yeah, if we can all do the virtual thank you to Nick through rounds of applause, that would be awesome. And thanks everybody for participating and for your questions.
Perfect. And thank you, Liz. And thank you, everyone, for coming. And please do get in touch. Even if you just have questions, or, this is work that you're doing and you would like to chat about it.
Right. Thanks, everyone.
Perfect.